The airport terminal was bustling with energy. Travelers hurried along the polished floors, luggage wheels clicking in rapid rhythm as they navigated their way through security checkpoints. The smell of coffee mingled with the faint scent of jet fuel, and the air buzzed with announcements calling passengers to their gates. Among the sea of faces, an elderly woman stood quietly, her presence almost unnoticeable amidst the chaos. Her name was Eleanor Jennings. Eleanor was not a woman of means. Her silver-gray hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest cloche hat, and she wore a simple but clean beige coat that had clearly seen better days. In one hand, she clutched a small, well-worn handbag, and in the other, she held a boarding pass, her fingers trembling ever so slightly from age rather than nerves. She had never flown first class before. In fact, she hadn't flown at all in many years. But today was special. Her daughter had saved up for months to buy her a ticket home, and somehow, by some stroke of luck or kindness, she had been told there was an upgrade waiting for her. Approaching the gate, Eleanor offered a polite, hopeful smile to the young woman stationed behind the counter. The attendant was dressed immaculately in her airline uniform, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she checked passenger lists. "Excuse me, dear," Eleanor began softly, her voice warm but uncertain. "I was told there might be a mistake. I was upgraded to first class." The attendant barely looked up. Her expression was neutral, if not a bit impatient. Without pausing her typing, she responded, "Your ticket says economy, ma'am. If there was an upgrade, it would show here." Eleanor's smile faltered. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly closed it again. She wasn't the kind of person to make a fuss. She wasn't asking for luxury. She only mentioned it because it was what she'd been told. She didn't expect anything. A businessman standing nearby, dressed in a sharp navy suit, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Come on, lady," he scoffed. "We all pay good money for first class. You don't just walk up and get a free upgrade because you ask nicely." There was a ripple of agreement among the passengers within earshot. Some shook their heads. Others avoided looking at her entirely, pretending not to notice. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. She lowered her gaze and clutched her handbag a little tighter. "I understand," she murmured, stepping aside without another word. The attendant waved her through the gate, not even sparing her a second glance. Eleanor made her way down the jet bridge slowly, her small frame moving with care. She entered the aircraft and shuffled down the narrow aisle until she reached her seat, an economy seat, wedged tightly between two restless travelers. She settled in without complaint, placing her handbag on her lap and adjusting her hat. She forced a small, polite smile, the kind she had perfected over a lifetime of not causing trouble. The cabin filled as more passengers boarded. Overhead bins slammed shut. Flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisle, assisting passengers and checking seatbelts. The hum of voices died down as the last of the travelers settled into their places. And then the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a deep, steady voice. "This is your captain speaking. Before we depart, I'd like to announce a change in our seating arrangements." Confused glances passed between passengers. A few looked up from their devices, curious. Eleanor barely registered the announcement, assuming it had nothing to do with her. But then the captain spoke again. "Would Mrs. Eleanor Jennings please make her way to the front of the plane?" The words hung in the air like a shockwave. Eleanor blinked, startled. Surely she had misheard. Passengers turned to look at her, some with curiosity, others with something resembling annoyance. The businessman from earlier shifted in his seat, his smirk fading. A flight attendant appeared beside Eleanor's row, offering a kind, genuine smile. "Mrs. Jennings," she said warmly, "the captain has requested you come to the front." Eleanor hesitated. For a moment, she considered refusing. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but something in the attendant's expression reassured her. Slowly, she rose from her seat, clutching her handbag as if it were a lifeline. She moved down the aisle as dozens of eyes followed her progress. The curtain separating economy from first class was pulled back, revealing a space that seemed like an entirely different world. Wide leather seats, ample legroom, a quiet, serene atmosphere. And there, standing just outside the cockpit, was the captain. He was a tall man in his 40s, his uniform crisp, his bearing commanding. As she approached, he removed his cap, holding it respectfully at his side. His eyes softened as they met hers, and for a moment, he seemed almost overcome. "Mrs. Jennings," he greeted her, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Eleanor blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, dear," she replied gently, "but do I know you?" A faint, wistful smile tugged at the captain's lips. "No, ma'am," he said softly, "but you knew my mother." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She searched his face, trying to place him. "Your mother," she echoed. The captain nodded. "Her name was Helen Carter. Years ago, when she was young and lost and alone in this world, you helped her." And then, like a wave crashing over her, Eleanor remembered. Decades earlier, on a cold winter night in Chicago, she had found a young woman sitting on a park bench in the rain. Helen had been shivering, soaked through, and clutching a battered duffel bag. She had nowhere to go, no family, no job. She was broken in spirit and in body. Eleanor hadn't hesitated. She took Helen to a nearby diner, bought her a hot meal, and listened as she cried softly over coffee. When a meal was done, Eleanor used the little money she had to pay for a room at a nearby boarding house. Before they parted, she had said something simple but sincere. "When you get back on your feet, promise me you'll help someone else." The captain's voice brought her back to the present. "My mother never forgot you," he said quietly. "Because of you, she went back to school. She became a teacher. She built a life. She raised me to be a man who always repays kindness." Eleanor's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She had never expected to hear these words. She hadn't helped Helen for thanks or recognition. She did it because it was right. The captain straightened and turned to address the entire first-class cabin and, through the curtain, much of the plane beyond. His voice was strong as he made his announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the privilege of honoring someone who once gave my mother a second chance at life. For the remainder of this flight, Mrs. Eleanor Jennings will be my personal guest in first class." There was a murmur throughout the cabin. The businessman in economy looked down, suddenly ashamed. Others who had dismissed her earlier now stared with wide eyes. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "Oh dear," she whispered. "I couldn't possibly." The captain smiled gently and held out his cap. "My mother would have wanted this," he said. For the first time in many years, Eleanor allowed herself to accept kindness instead of offering it. She followed the captain to her seat, settling into the wide, comfortable chair. A flight attendant brought her a warm blanket and a cup of tea. And something changed in the atmosphere of the plane. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were thinking, reflecting. The businessman from earlier approached quietly. He cleared his throat and gave her an apologetic glance. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I shouldn't have assumed." Eleanor gave him a soft, understanding smile. "It's never too late to see people differently, dear." A young mother holding a sleeping toddler leaned over and whispered, "I want my son to grow up knowing there are people like you in the world." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Kindness is everywhere, my dear," she replied. "You just have to be willing to look." As the flight continued, a sense of unity filled the cabin. The businessman pulled out his checkbook, scribbled something quickly, and handed it to a flight attendant. "For Mrs. Jennings," he said quietly. "Donate it in her honor." Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. She never needed recognition. She didn't care about fancy seats. But in that moment, she realized she had gained something far more valuable, the hearts of those around her. When the plane finally landed, the captain escorted her to the exit. She clutched his cap in her hands as she stepped into the terminal. And then, without warning, it happened. Applause. Passengers clapped as she walked by, not because she had demanded respect or fought for it, but because she had earned it. Eleanor smiled to herself as she made her way toward baggage claim. Kindness, she thought, never truly disappears. Sometimes it just finds its way home. And kindness, she realized, is a currency that never loses its value. What she had given so long ago had returned when she least expected it. Now it's our turn. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, don't let it end here. Pass it forward. Share a story of kindness that changed your life. Leave a comment. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, hit that like button so others can find them. Subscribe because we're just getting started. And the next story might be the one you never knew you needed. Kindness is never wasted. It always finds its way home.